So all of those piled together, and Walt thought, when I build my Mickey Mouse Park, what's going to happen is we're going to have some type of haunted house experience. So even in the earliest drawings that Walt was doing in 52 and 53, there was a haunted house. You would go down to the end of Main Street, and at the end of Main Street, you would turn to the right. There's a street there. There's a street there today. What is the name of that street? Center Street is the one in the center. What's the name of the street at the end of Main Street? Plaza Street. Plaza, I know you're going, okay, I'm going to, next trivia contest, I win. Okay, so on Plaza Street, what would happen is there would have been an old church. Behind the church would have been a cemetery, and you went up the hill, and there was this house on top of the hill overlooking the cemetery and overlooking the church. And in fact, the first experience was you were going to walk up there and you would press your little faces against the windows and you could see what was going on inside the house. So it was a controlled environment. Later, Walt said, no, we've got to immerse the guests into this experience. So he brought in Ken Anderson, who designed Elliot the Dragon and did so many wonderful pieces of art for Disney. Brought him in 1957 to come up with a concept of a haunted house that was going to be interactive. So you would come in with groups of anywhere from 20 to 100 people, and you would take them into the house, and the entire floor would sink. And there you would go through and you would meander and see these things. And there were a bunch of different storylines. In fact, in one of them, at the end, you were at this big party, just like this one right here, and suddenly, in the distance, out the back window, you see the Headless Horseman. And he goes off, and then he comes a little closer and a little closer, and suddenly he breaks through the double doors there, the window, and there's rain and all of this, and the guide has to hustle you out of the house for that to happen. But Walt started to realize that this is a problem with capacity, bringing people through. We've got to come up with another way of doing that. He had a group of Imagineers who were constantly working on effects. One of them was Yale Gracie. Yale Gracie at the time was not known as an Imagineer, he was known as an Illusioneer. And he created all sorts of magic effects. He's the one who came up with the fire effect at the end of Pirates of the Caribbean, for instance. He's the one who came up with Pepper's ghost of the dancing ghosts in the ballroom. And where he got that idea for Pepper's ghost from was from a book that he saved as a kid called The Boy Mechanic, printed in 1913. So yes, you can go get one on eBay for only $5, and you can go be an Imagineer and go through and take a look, and you'd say, oh my gosh, take a look. That's how that illusion came about. So Yale Gracie and Rolly Crump were sitting in a room, and Walt was paying them just to come up with ideas for the haunted house. And Rolly Crump told me that at one time he was very, very scared because he was sitting there working on these things, and he turns to Yale and he goes, well, Yale, you don't believe in ghosts, right? And Yale goes, oh yeah, there are ghosts. And Rolly says, well, what do you mean? And Yale said, when I was 8 years old, my mom took me back east to visit my aunt and my cousins. And at the end, we were there for about a week, and at the end of the week, at the breakfast table, my mom said, what was the most fun you had, your week? Was it meeting the cousins? Was it, seeing, things on the East Coast, whatever? And Yale, being 8 years old, said, the most fun was the little lady who lives in the closet who comes out each night and reads to us. And his cousins were going, no, don't say anything. She won't come back. And Yale's mother went to the local library, did some research, found that there was an old lady who had lived in that house, and they had a picture, and it looked just like, and Yale goes, yeah, she's the one. And she never came back. Now, while they were working over there, they were experimenting with all sorts of gags that could be incorporated into the haunted mansion. And so Rowley said they came up with this one, and he says, my wife made this out of Chinese silk and all of this. So it's sitting on the ground, and then when you trigger it, the air comes up, so it starts to flap around, and we put a head on it, and so the head would get bigger and bigger, and then explode in all of this black goop, and there'd be these horrible sounds, and he says, oh, this was just magnificent. He said, you know, we were doing all of these strange things. We had a man in the shape of a candle, and he was constantly melting and all that. And he says, one day we got a call from the personnel department, and they said, Mr. Crump, we've gotten a request from the janitors, could you leave the lights on in the room at night? And so Rowley goes, oh yeah, sure. So what he and Yale set up was this little infrared beam set up. So they went home, and next morning they came back, and there in the middle of the room, there's this ghost, and it's flapping, and its head is exploded and all that, and in the center of the room, there's a broom. And the phone rings, and Rowley picks it up, and it's the personnel department, and says, I just want to let you know, they are never coming back to clean your room again. And they had rigged it so, you know, you hit the infrared thing, and the thing just explodes and goes. Now, one of the things that happened too is Walt dropped by, and this was in 1960, and a movie had just been released called 13 Ghosts. Now, none of you are probably old enough to remember this, but it was by William Castle, and it had Illusiono. So you had these special glasses, one side was red, one side was blue, so in the movie you got a warning that if you wanted to see the ghost, you put on the glasses and you looked through the red side. And if you were a wimp, you looked through the blue side, which, you know, wiped out any ghosts on the screen for that. So they went down one afternoon and they just saw this, because they thought, oh yeah, this would be a good idea. They also went and they saw a movie called The Haunting. And in The Haunting, there's a series of doors that start to breathe in and out and in and out. Oh yeah, we've got to incorporate that. We've got to incorporate that. We've got to go through all of these things. So they were constantly coming up with this, and it's like, but how are we going to get people through? How are you going to get people through all of this? Well, during this whole process, because the Haunted Mansion was erected at Disneyland in 1963, it did not open until 1969 because they didn't know how to do the inside. Well, in between that time, what happened was the New York World's Fair, and they came up with, for the Ford Motor Skyway, the way to move cars along, and that developed into the Omni-Mover, the Doom buggies, which originally were going to be shaped like coffins. So you would get into your own coffin and be taken through all of this to happen. And of course, because it was built and it was standing in 1963, but it wasn't open, and there was a big sign outside that said, you know, ghosts can apply, but not in person, to Disney Ghost Relations. And, you know, for this retirement home, there were all these stories that, oh, it was so scary that a woman had a heart attack, and so now they have to go back through. And no, it was just a shell, because most of you know the show building for it is on the other side of the train tracks. That's why the stretching room came up, because you literally had to go in and you had to be dropped underground so you could walk underneath the train tracks, you know, into where the show building was. Now out here in Florida, of course, we have an aquifer, so you dig down 2 feet and you get water. So out here in Florida, it doesn't go down. It really literally does stretch up for that to happen. Now, one of the reasons that also delayed it from opening in 1969 was the death of Walt in 1966. This was hugely emotional. I know for many of us it's emotional, but try to imagine for people who worked with Walt day to day, who loved him, who did everything they could do to please him, and didn't even know he was ill, and then be told the next day, he's not here anymore. And so the Disney company for a long while was leaderless, because Walt was the one who was always going to make the final decision. A lot of different people get involved, with a project, sometimes without knowing that Walt has other people working on all this. And then what happened is, as happens in some companies when the leader is gone, is there was that struggle for power. So Claude Coates, Yale Gracie, Rolly Crump said, it's a haunted mansion. People are going to expect things scary. We've got to put scary things in there. Mark Davis says, no, this is Disney. We don't want to scare little kids. You know, we want things accessible to everybody. It needs to be funny. You know, and by golly, I put funny things into the Jungle Cruise and that worked. You know, funny thing. And so there was this struggle and this battle of power. And so the Haunted Mansion became the first of what I call the Disney schizophrenic attractions. I think the primary schizophrenic attraction is Splash Mountain. Because the first part of that, my little nephews would love. Yeah. My mom and dad, they passed away several years ago, but they would have enjoyed that and all the art. But boy, taking that last plunge, that would have put them in the grave. But I also have a niece and nephew, you know, who are, well, one's now 17 and one's 20. And they love the plunge, but they get diabetic seeing all the funny little creatures, you know. Do we have to, you know? So they put on their iPod until, you know, the big thing. So the same thing happened with Haunted Mansion. It became a schizophrenic attraction. So the first half of the attraction, you have some of those spooky elements. You have the doors. You have, you know, sounds. You have the wallpaper with the eyes. And by the way, when you are counting 999 happy haunts, you have to count those eyes as well. They're haunted as well. And they're keeping an eye on you. Tony Baxter says those are part of the ghosts that you have to count. Because there's only about 100 audio animatronics in the attraction for that to happen. And then what happens is it suddenly, around the ballroom scene, it lightens up. And then you get into the graveyard scene, and it lightens up. All that. So it's like, oh, okay. Oh, this is funny. I don't even worry about being scared. We talked about Ex Atencio writing Grim Grinning Ghost. He is also the voice of the person who is in the coffin, who is saying, get me out of here, get me out of trap. That is the voice of Ex Atencio. And that happened a lot in those days because the cheapest people to have do voices were those who are already on salary working at the company. So you had that. Ex Atencio is also the one who does the voice of Dead Men Tell No Tales. That's the voice of Ex Atencio as well. So anyway, the Haunted Mansion opened at Disneyland in 1969. Huge, huge hit. But it took twice as long to build everything inside there. Because at the exact same time, they were building the interior for Walt Disney World. They realized Walt Disney World was going to be opening in 1971, so they built double sets of everything and put it into storage. And so the Haunted Mansion at Walt Disney World was complete and locked down April 1971. 6 months before the opening of the park. That house was there. But you know, one of the things I think we should do is we should revel in how different Walt Disney World is from Disneyland. Everybody thinks that it's a clone. I'm a California boy. I grew up in Glendale, California. I went to Disneyland a lot. And it was a Twilight Zone experience to set foot in the Magic Kingdom. And it was similar, but it was different, you know? And as I was directing people to the Pinocchio ride, and they were looking at me as if I had a third head, no, when you go into Fantasyland, it's on the left-hand side, right after the Snow White ride. No, the Snow White ride's on the right. No, it's there, and then you go on, and then there's Pinocchio. And then you can, you know. The mansion out here is different. And you know that Disney's Haunted Mansion is the only Disney attraction that is in 4 different lands in the parks around the world. Right? Out in California, it's in New Orleans Square, which is where Walt really originally intended that to be, because he was thinking of voodoo and and all of that. And at one point, Claude Coates had come up with an idea that it was a mansion that was sinking in the bayou, and so you would go through in a boat through the attraction and see those ghosts. Out here, it's in Liberty Square. Out in Tokyo, it is in Fantasyland, because the Japanese have a rich fantasy history of ghosts. So if you're familiar with Japanese storytelling and folklore, there are all those ghosts. That's why it's in Fantasyland. Out in Paris, it's in Frontierland, because Tony Baxter says we went out there and we said, we can't make this any spookier than what you can find just outside of Paris. There are graveyards, there's crumbling, castles and mansions and all that. But if we put it into the Wild West, the Parisians think of Americans as these cowboys. So we'll do that. And for that, they had Vincent Price record the voice track as the ghost host, and then they found out nobody was listening. Or they didn't speak the language, so none of that came across. So all those tracks are resting in WED somewhere. Out here in Florida, it's part of Liberty Square, and it's interesting because it's an extension of the Hudson River Valley. Now, why does that make any sense? Hudson River? Well, because the writer in Hudson River Valley was Washington Irving. And if you go to that fast food place, the Sleepy Hollow, and you get your funnel cake and all of that, funnel cake's the greatest thing in the world. One of the main food groups, that is actually designed after Washington Irving's house. And so I've been into the Hudson River Valley, and it really is, it can be a very spooky place. So you can see where Washington Irving got some of his ideas. And so what was going to happen was to theme in with Liberty Square and all this. This is on the East Coast. This is an East Coast park. It's the Hudson River Valley. So when we're talking about the rivers of America, that's the Hudson River out there, before it then goes into the Missouri and into the Mississippi and into the Colorado and all of those others. It starts there with the Hudson on the east, and then go. Didn't know that, huh? No. I know, that's why you guys bring me in here and pay me the big bucks, all right? At least in candy, all right? So you also need to realize some of you may have, well, I know Bob was. Some of you were here in 1971. If you saw the Haunted Mansion, there was no outdoor canopy. And in fact, the landscaping was beautiful. Because again, Walt felt, listen, this is Disney. We want to have this image of cleanliness and cleanness, and let the ghosts take care of the inside. We'll take care of the outside. So the one out here, which is based on the Harry Packer mansion in Pennsylvania. Isn't it amazing I can remember this without notes? Actually, I can make all of this up, and you guys have no idea. But it really is the Harry Packer mansion. And it was wonderfully, landscaped. Now it's more overgrown. But again, it looked too friendly. So Claude Coates put on two side wings to the house, so it looks like claws are coming out at you. Next time you're standing in line, whether you're waiting to get into the interactive queue or you're complaining with the person you're with, how come they put an interactive queue? That's not what Walt would have wanted. Whatever you're doing, take a look at the front of the house, and you'll notice the front door is in the shape of a coffin. It's very subtle, but once I've told you this, you'll never be able to unsee that. And those planters out in front, cremation urns. Oh my gosh, so there are a lot of differences out here, that wonderful attention to detail. Now, I've interviewed a lot of Imagineers, and you would think, well, I'm interviewing an Imagineer. He must know what's going on, and especially if he was there, he must know. That's not the case at all. Some people only saw part of the project, or they have their own agenda they want to push, or whatever. I love Mark Davis dearly, but he said, Walt never wanted a story in a ride. No, never wanted that at all, And that's why we make sure there's no story in there, because he doesn't. And it's like, no, that's not the case. I've got some quotes from Walt where he likes the idea that it's storytelling in the dark rides and things like that. But Mark was trying to justify, why, he's adding in some things that don't really complete what's the first part of the attraction as it goes in there. But Ken Anderson in '57 came up with a storyline. He came up with 4 storylines, but they were all really off this basic storyline. And it's still in our haunted mansion today out here in Florida. And his storyline was there was a sea captain. And this is, and believe it or not, he was not writing it for a southern mansion. He was originally writing it for a New England haunted house. There was a sea captain. And the sea captain was very prosperous. That's why he had the house that he had, all that. And he decided to marry a much younger woman, which we all know, yes, is a big mistake. In fact, several big mistakes at once. Marries a much younger woman. And of course, the younger woman goes, my gosh, you know, I'm 17 and here's this old guy and he's got a lot of money and the clock's ticking on him. You know, the average lifespan of a man in this era, you know, I'll be having horses and ponies and everything. So anyway, what happens is on their wedding day, the one thing he told her is, don't go rummaging around in the attic. The exact wrong thing to tell anybody, right? But especially a 17-year-old girl. Stay out of the West Wing. Well, that's which way is west? Okay. Stay out of the attic. Well, on her wedding day, she figures, oh, I'm going to be his wife soon. I can go up there. So she goes up there. She finds an old sea chest. And it's locked up and all that. But she opens it up. And inside, she discovers that her husband-to-be had been a notorious pirate. And he couldn't, he just couldn't bear to get rid of some of these things, so he kept some things locked up in the sea chest there. But he's a notorious wanted pirate. And he comes up to the attic, sees her, and as much as he loves her, there's a lot of 17-year-old girls out there. And if he's outed as this pirate, he's going to hang. So he grabs her and throws her out the window. Arr. Arr. And in one version, he actually throws her into a well. And so when guests could walk by the well, if they were looking in the well, suddenly it would turn to blood red, and then it would go back to the water, all of this. But what happened is, and as you know, sometimes ghosts exist because they have unfinished business. There was a trauma in their life, or there's unfinished business. So what she did is she came back and she haunted him, drove him crazy. So the only way he could stop it is by hanging himself. However, that still doesn't prevent a wedding from taking place, which is why there's a party going on. Even in death, she's going to make sure that he lives up to that commitment, and there's going to be a wedding party. And so you can see elements of that. You know, that's why in the interactive queue you've got that coffin with the sea captain in it. And also when you get into the doom buggies to start to go, take a look up above. There's a portrait of the sea captain, and that's based on Ken Anderson's original sketches. So some of that is in there. Now Tony Baxter says that the Haunted Mansion actually is 3 acts. The first act is the anticipation of seeing ghosts. You don't actually see ghosts, but you see the manifestations of the ghosts. You see the busts, that their eyes follow you. You realize that those busts do that because they are concave, right? You could stick your hand right, you know, inside of them. And how they found that out is they were working on Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, and they had the mold for Lincoln's face, and they set it there backwards on the table, and as they were walking by, Lincoln was watching them back and forth. So they adapted that for the busts in the Haunted Mansion. And then the second act begins with Madame Leota, because she now calls the ghost to appear, to materialize. And all of you know that Madame Leota, the face was based on Leota Toombs. Leota Toombs was married to Harvey Toombs, who was a very well-known animator at the Disney Studios. Not one of the 9 old men, but all of that. And she was working in figure finishing. So she was putting feathers onto the tiki birds and, you know, helping with the little models and all that. And they just liked the look of her face and they brought her out. And so the night before she was to record this, her daughter, by the way, is Kim Irvine, who some of you know, who's an Imagineer currently with the company. The night before she was called in to record Leota's thing, she's at home and she's practicing this in front of a mirror just as Kim's boyfriend comes in to take her out to a school dance. And he backs away and he goes, "What's up with your mom?" And the next day when they brought in Leota and to sit down and record this, she was a lively woman. She was twitchy. So what they did, and boy, you can't get this through HR these days, they literally tied her hair to the chair so that her face wouldn't move, so that it would stay, so they could project it with 16mm film right on the image of the bust of Leota, so it looked like Leota was talking. However, they didn't like her voice because it was a little high-pitched, so they brought in Eleanor Audley to do the voice. Eleanor Audley did the voice of 2 Disney villainesses. Who were they? There you go, the stepmother in Cinderella and Maleficent. So she's that. But they loved Leota, so at the end of the ride where you have little Leota, that is Leota's voice. Oh. Hurry back, don't forget, that is exactly her voice. They're doing that. And so then you see the ghost, and then the third part is, my gosh, you're in the graveyard for the party. You're not just seeing the ghost, you're immersed in with the ghost. And so Tony Batcher says, yes, there is a clear Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Now, those of you who are still awake and have been paying attention, here's a little secret that you can pull on your friends and family. You know, you're up there on the attic, and then suddenly you're shoved out, and then you're falling back down. It's like, well, this is poorly planned. Shouldn't this lead into the next scene and all this? You are following in the footsteps of the bride. You are being thrown out the window. And that's why you're falling back. And by the way, when you're falling back, take a look to your right and take a look at the roof of the Haunted Mansion. It's slate.
Yes.
It is not the same as the top of our Haunted Mansion. It's not the same as the mansion out in Disneyland. So you're in a different realm. And you're falling back into your grave. Which is why the grave digger and his dog are looking at you and not at the ghosts. You are the 1000th ghost going in. I know, the little light bulb goes on, right? Oh, Jim, is this written down anywhere? No, it's going to be up to you to keep this going as that goes through for that to happen. And of course, at the end of the graveyard scene, you have the female opera singer, and she is placed there because it's not over until... And that's why the opera singer, female opera singer, is there as